Before we start lecture today, I want you to take just a moment to complete the 20 statement test. I want you to think for just a minute about your answer to the simple question, who am I? You don't actually have to write down 20 different answers, but just take a moment and think through a few of the options, things that you would have answered if you were writing this out for me. Think about this as though you are giving the answers to yourself, not someone else. Write your answers in the order that they occur to you. Don't worry about logic or importance. Okay, do you have a pretty good idea how you would answer this question? We'll go ahead and move into today's lecture now, where we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. We're going to start today by talking about interdependent self-construal. Those with interdependent self-construals, these are people who think of themselves as interdependent rather than independent beings, understand others well, and they strive to benefit others. They make pretty good friends. Really what we're talking about here are people who think of themselves as part of a relationship with other people. So part of how they think about themselves is in terms of their relationship, not just in terms of individual traits. Self-construal refers to the grounds of self-definition. So this is the extent to which the self is defined independently of others or interdependently. That means in connection with others. Marcus and Kitayama in 1991 really began the discussion about cross-cultural differences in self-construal in social psychology. They talked about independent self-construal. These are people who define themselves in terms of their internal attributes like traits, abilities, values, and preferences. And interdependent self-construal. These are people who define themselves in terms of their relationships with others and their roles. For example, if I were defining myself in terms of independent attributes, I would talk about the fact that I'm fairly agreeable, somewhat neurotic, that I enjoy reading, and I don't like tomatoes. If I were to use more interdependent descriptions, I might describe myself as Eliana's mother, or Lisa's best friend, or Sharon's daughter, or I might describe myself as a woman or a psychologist, right? So these are things that really refer to our relationships and our roles. This was originally described as a cultural difference. According to Marcus and Kitayama, Western or more industrialized cultures tend to be independent, whereas Eastern or less industrialized cultures tend to be more interdependent. It turns out, however, that there's really more variability within these countries than might be expected. Even though the United States might be considered a relatively independent culture, there are a lot of people within the United States who tend to think of themselves more in interdependent terms. There is variability. Now, Cross, Bacon, and Morris in 2000 adapted this concept. They began to describe the relational interdependent self-construal. So this is the idea that people think of themselves in terms of relationships with close others. So it's not just the fact that you are in a particular role or that you're part of a particular group. It's the fact that you think of yourself in terms of those relationships. So specifically, my relationship with my mother. I am Sharon's daughter, right? That becomes more important in this perspective. Now, you may think that women might be more likely to have a relational interdependent self-construal than men. And in fact, you'd be right. But does that mean that women are actually more sociable than men? If we go back to the idea that we all have this fundamental need to belong, we might ask, aren't social connections also important to men? Well, it turns out this question was the premise for a study by Gabriel and Gardner in 1999. They called it, Are There His and Hers Types of Interdependence? And the general idea here is that you can have a personal aspect to the self. So these are your independent qualities, like I am conscientious. You can also have a relational aspect. This would be the relational interdependent self. So I am Sharon's daughter or Lisa's best friend. You can also have a collective aspect. This is derived from our group memberships. So again, I'm a psychologist, I am a woman, perhaps I'm a Houston Texans fan. These group memberships become a part of ourselves as well. So their overall hypothesis is that women would focus more on relational aspects of interdependence, these one-on-one relationships. I would define myself more in terms of my relationships with my mother or my best friend. Whereas men would focus more on collective aspects of interdependence. So they might focus more on being a sports fan or they might be more likely to think of themselves in terms of other group membership, so maybe being a man. So the first thing that they did was they had participants complete the 20 statements test. So this is what I had you do at the beginning of class. They asked their participants to respond to the prompt, I am. Then they coded those responses for independent, relational, and collective descriptors. Take a minute to think about that. When you were describing yourself, did you describe yourself mostly in terms of traits, mostly in terms of relationships, or mostly in terms of your group? And that can give you a feel for the extent to which you have a relatively independent self-construal, a relational interdependent self-construal, or a collective interdependent self-construal. And they looked at men and women and how many of their self-construals were related to more relational interdependent self-construal and how many were related to more collective interdependent self-construal. So you might wonder, okay, men or women, what do you think? Who uses more relational? As you might expect, women tended to report more relational traits or attributes than men did. This is consistent with previous research in this and the general idea that women might have these stronger dyadic relationships than men. But again, that goes against the idea that everyone has a fundamental need to belong. And so men should have these connections as well, and they may also color their perceptions of themselves. They also looked at collective self-construal. And they found that men actually tended to use collective self-construal more often than women did. We see a clear effect here where women use relational more, men use collective more. And if we added these up, we'd get pretty similar rates of using these interdependent self-descriptors. For study 2, they had participants complete 2 scales. One was the relational interdependent self-construal scale, and one was the collective interdependent self-construal scale. So do you think women scored higher on relational self-construal than men? And do you think men scored higher on collective self-construal than women? Well, there was a slight tendency for women to score more highly than men on relational self-construal, although it's not as strong as we might have expected. But there was a reversal. So men were more likely to describe themselves as part of their groups or describe those groups as being an important part of their selves. So we get this gender difference again, where women are slightly more likely to engage in relational self-construal, and men are more likely to engage in collective self-construal. In their third study, they asked participants to recall and describe a happy or a sad event. And then they had coders go through the essays and rate those events as describing an independent event, a relational event, or a collective event. In terms of relational events, you might predict that women would describe more of those events as relational than men, or they would describe more relational events than men. And you would be right. They did find that women tended to write about relational events more often than men did. But do we see the opposite for collective events? Yes. In this case, they did find that men tended to write about collective events more often than women did. Altogether, this is consistent with the idea that there's a fundamental need to belong. Both women and men include social ties in their self-construals, their self-concepts, how they think about themselves. However, the type of social information that they use, in this set of studies, women were more likely to include these one-on-one relationships as part of their selves, whereas men were more likely to include these group memberships as part of their selves.